Hey, Don.
Hey, long time no see.
We're gonna be streaming this on Facebook as well, just FYI, so people will be able to go back and watch it if need be.
Awesome. And you'll record it as well?
Yeah, it's recording now. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. All right. All right. You are now the host.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We have a few people watching on Facebook Live already, it looks like.
Do you think I should go ahead and start or wait and see if anybody, it's not quite 12 yet, is it? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
3.
not yet. 3. Yeah.
Okay, we'll give it a little bit of time.
And-
See if some other people jump on. Thank you.
Yeah.
They'll be able to see on Facebook, they can see the presentation, right?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Rachel, will you be hanging out in case we get any questions on Facebook?
Sure, I can do that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. I clicked the button in a different spot than I typically do to unmute myself. So
I just learned this week that you can use the space bar, and it was like, wow.
yeah, mind blown, right?
So you think we should wait for a little bit longer? Is there what, 1, 2 people on Facebook now? I'll go ahead and jump in since it's being recorded. We can always post it later. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my background. I'm licensed in North Carolina and in Florida. I was born and raised in Florida and had a unique opportunity. At 18 years old, I started working for a commercial property management company just as a file clerk. I had no idea that it would turn into a lifelong career. It was really a great opportunity. By the time I was 19, I was managing my first commercial property, had an opportunity to work on all different types of commercial assets and really see commercial projects from the inside out. And I feel like that background and experience in property management is a great asset to me on the sales side. It gives me experience that other leasing or sales agents may not have in commercial real estate. So I'm pretty proud of that. I was 15 years in Florida in commercial real estate and then started following my husband's career around a bit. We moved to San Francisco Bay Area in California, and that was sort of a leap of faith and was we were there for 4 years, and during that time I decided to explore entrepreneurship, and I really enjoyed it. I became a business owner, small business owner, doing bookkeeping for small businesses. To me, it was a real sidestep because when I was managing properties, many times we were doing full accounting for a building, and each building and each person that owns the building or entity is like its own business. It really is. So for me, doing bookkeeping for small businesses was very similar, if not exactly the same, to what I had been doing my whole life. So that was really great. I did that for about 4 years. And then when my husband had this job opportunity in North Carolina, I say that my husband moved for the job, but I moved for the house. We definitely did not have that type of opportunity in California to buy and own a home of this size with a yard. So I was really excited to take the leap and move back to the East Coast. As soon as we came out here, I knew I was going to get back into real estate. And I had this opportunity. It was a very unique position for me where I could really do whatever I wanted. And I was like, wow, I would really love to try real estate sales. And so I've been down that path for the past year since we've been here. And again, I'm really enjoying it. And the fact that I have that background from commercial property management, I think, is giving me an inside track to the building owner's perspective and what people are looking for. So I do have some personal goals. I want to open a property management company out here for commercial, of course. I only strictly do commercial. I'm happy to refer business for residential. Even if I were to buy my own house, I would refer that out to someone else. My goal is also to grow a team. I'd love to see commercial have its own presence here in Cornelius at our Lake Norman office. And everywhere in this sort of Charlotte area, you know, it's a really nice market for the commercial world and the commercial space as well. So I'd love to grow a team out here. I enjoy collaboration through my entire career. I found that I lead through collaboration. I like to get everyone's opinion. And then of course I have to make the decision, but it generally helps in my process to go through different ideas with people. And I just think that that's a neat way for me to live my life. You know, I'm able to lead from the examples of others. Getting other people on board with your ideas tends to be a good leadership strategy for me, and sort of leading from behind in a way. So I also want to teach, and that's why I was attracted to Keller Williams. All of the programs and learning-based trainings that they have available for people, and that could be an opportunity that I can share what I know in the future. So this all sort of fit within my goals, and that's why this location and this firm was the best choice for me in going forward. So today I'm going to just talk about an overview on commercial real estate. We'll see if I can actually fill in the whole hour. The main thing with commercial real estate is that we're constantly trying to find the highest and best use for a property. So with residential, you know what the use is. You're going to live there. And that's the main driver to get you into that type of a property. For commercial, there's lots of different uses for spaces. And it's not necessarily the original intention of the property. I've also enjoyed, like in the last decade, people have gotten really creative with different assets. And I had a couple of examples. So there was this mall in New York that they actually turned into a residential building. So they took each of the spaces that were for mall users and turned them into apartments. And it was really popular. You know, and at times like this, when retail has already had a downturn and now we're dealing with coronavirus and the effects of that, retail is probably going to be one of the biggest hit sectors. And so being able to repurpose something in this way is very neat and creative. I've also seen a lot of lately industrial turn into retail. So for areas where you are having a new influx of population, our area is really a great example of that, because you may have had an area which was very rural that's now being becoming more suburban. And so you need to cater to those people and they need places to shop. But it may have been more rural with some more industrial type uses. So industrial turning into retail. I had an example of this. I'm not quite sure because I haven't been here long enough, but Duckworth's in Huntersville, I'm pretty sure probably used to be an industrial property. And they have these really cool industrial high bay doors that are all glass. And so like during the day, they'll open it up if it's a nice day. I've seen that done throughout the country. There's some specific developers that focus on repurposing spaces like that specifically. So those are some interesting ways that you can repurpose properties. But sometimes you have a very specific use that it was intended for, a church or an old post office, and then it turns into an area that doesn't meet that use anymore. And so people have converted those into homes or other types of creative uses of the space. So those are some of my favorite things to do, is look at a building and what it has, all of its attributes in the surrounding areas, and something else you could repurpose. It's basically like repurposing on a commercial building level. So I really enjoy that type of thing. And I mean, really every deal is different. Everything you work on is different. There's no boilerplates for anything. There's no templates for anything. Everything is, everything's negotiable. Everything is sort of like still the wild, wild west in the commercial field. Okay, so I'm going to share a few slides. Let's see if I can do this. It should be coming through now. Okay, so I wanted to start with some of the differences between commercial and residential. I don't know if you can see that box, but I'm going to move it out of the way just in case, because I can't. Okay, so for residential, and I don't do residential, so if anyone out there has something to add, or they think that I may not have hit it right on the residential side, feel free to correct me. I'd love to update the slide. So from what I've seen on the residential side, you focus primarily on when you're prospecting on scripts and sort of like blasting out emails, and you're prospecting to a large group of people. On the commercial side, for us to prospect, we have to be very specific on who we're prospecting to and really researching them. So if we're researching a specific, we're targeting or prospecting a specific building or property, we're going to want to do a lot of searches. So we're going to be Googling, we're going to be checking all of the zoning and use for that space. Are there other things that could be done for that building, other zoning capabilities for that space? Who is the owner? A lot of times we're going to see that it's owned by a corporation, or an LLC is very popular for commercial ownerships. And then we have to find out who's behind that and who owns it, who the individual person is. A lot of times there's so many layers that it's very hard to find even a person to call. And when you do call them, we have to be very targeted on what we're asking. We want to make sure that they know that we've done some research and then we know the area, and that we have this background and knowledge of their property, so that we're asking some really good questions. I do try to script a little bit, but it's very specific to that property. So I'm doing research and I'm sort of coming up with questions for that specific property owner on that specific property before I make a call. So on the residential side, you might have very specific forms. You have all of your template forms to use. Most of the time, we're going to have to use drafted contract. There are some boilerplate forms available to us, but for the most part, we're going to have an attorney involved, and they're actually drafting the contract. Again, because everything's negotiable, there's so many different terms that go into both a lease and a purchase agreement. Those get very specific. They're all very different, and so you need an attorney to draft those. We can't just fill in the blanks most of the time. On the residential side, you're probably working nights and weekends, doing showings, open houses. On the commercial side, we really stick to business hours. I would say the caveat to that is, as a property manager, if a fire alarm's going off in the middle of the night, obviously we have to respond. But for the most part, you know, if something happens on a commercial property, you can generally respond to it during business hours. And most of our clients or prospects are going to be looking at things and handling their business during business hours, because it's a business for them. On the residential side, you use MLS and use MLS searching. On the commercial side, we primarily use LoopNet and CoStar, and I'll go into those a little bit later. For the residential side, you have the Realtor Association. I am a member of the Realtor Association, but they also have another layer called the Commercial Realtors Association, and I'm a member of that as well. It's basically the same thing, except they don't have their own MLS, and it's just another layer. We have some more forms. I don't know, you may even have access to those forms, but there's another layer. It is a separate association, and so we do have separate membership to that if you want to. That's sort of elective. You probably deal with some sort of a centralized showing service. We, on the commercial side, will always meet an agent and the client to do a tour of a property. If you're on the leasing side, that can be really time consuming. We've been doing a lot of virtual tours lately, but generally, even after a virtual tour, a lot of my prospects are still wanting to go physically look at the space. So that's pretty consistent. On the residential side, I'm guessing that, you know, generally you're asking the seller for a list price or wanting to know what they expect to get out of their home when they're selling the home. Again, I haven't been involved in that process. That's just sort of my guess. But on our side, the seller's really looking for us to advise them. They want us to give them a number. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the number that they're going to pick, but they want our advice. They want us to advise them on what the market is doing and what their comps are. And a lot of times it's not like, because every deal is different, every building is different, it's really hard to find comparables, because you're not necessarily going to have three bedroom houses in the same area. We're really dealing with very different types of assets and having to really compare those. And in terms of advising clients on this. It's really not so much what they want to get out of it, it's what someone's willing to pay for it. So that's where our advisement comes in. As far as it goes with the state, it's the same for commercial and residential agents. Your license works the same as mine for commercial deals. I actually wish that there was more training available. So in terms of websites, we use a lot of different websites. I'm not sure if any of you use this, but I think definitely the MLS. Obviously, you guys are using the MLS to find listings. There are some commercial listings on there. Generally, I find that the commercial listings on there are being listed by residential agents. And that's what they know and that's what they use. So I do use the MLS to check for listings when I'm trying to find something for a prospect. But generally, most of what I get comes from LoopNet and CoStar. So that next one, LoopNet and CoStar, are different, but they are sister companies. They're actually the same ownership. LoopNet is, it's a paid service where you can market your properties, but it's really for the external user. It's really like kind of the Zillow of the commercial world. So you're going to see a lot of information there in LoopNet. It's not necessarily as accurate as what I get on CoStar, but it is available to the general public. There is some information that is hidden from the public and they have to have the paid service in order to get access to it. On CoStar, I see all of the listings that are on LoopNet, as well as anything else that comes up in the area. So I think CoStar is a very expensive service that I pay for, and it's really nationally known as the go-to place for commercial real estate and finding listings. And it's a very nice tool, but it doesn't have some of the since the MLS is mandated through the Realtors Association, I find that I think that the regulations around listings are much better than the way that CoStar does it. But we just have to use CoStar. It is the place to get listings. And I kind of have these out of order. You can get some things on Crexi. So I do check that system as well, but it's sort of a newer, it's less expensive. In fact, I think Crexi is free, but it's you're not going to probably get all of the listings that you would get on CoStar. CoStar is also really nice from a commercial prospecting perspective because you see all properties that are listed and not listed. So you're actually getting full information, and it links to the database for the county and all of the plot plans, and so you get a lot of information from CoStar. Including historical data on the property, who owned the property, when did it change hands. So you get a lot of information from CoStar that, you know, is kind of a one-stop shop there. Obviously, a CRM system is really necessary to maintain database, and there's lots of different CRM systems out there. ClientLook is the database that's recommended for KW commercial agents. We have Prospect Now, which is also an interesting, it's another prospecting tool. You can find listings on there. Again, anything that you find in Prospect Now, you're probably going to find in CoStar, but that's another software that's provided to us or given to us from KW Commercial as another tool. ROI Muse is for financial analysis. That's a paid service to put financial data, and it sort of spits out a financial analysis for you. And then Build Out is what we use, the tool that we use or is recommended by KW Commercial for our brochures and for commercial packaging. So everything in Command right now, or what you have, is really focused on residential. They are working on the commercial side, but we don't have that capability yet. A lot of the tools in Command haven't quite reached the commercial side for KW Commercial. They know about it, they're working on it. And so I actually do use Command somewhat for the tool, the CRM tool, and for some of the lead tracking. But I'm excited for when they have that tooled a little bit better for commercial. We still run all of our deals through that. So types of properties. So again, with homes, you know, I know that you have different levels of homes, and for us, we really have a couple of different types of buyers. You've got the owner user. So that's sort of like for a business owner, they need a building to operate out of, and they buy a building just because that gives them an opportunity to be building equity rather than paying rent. Or you might be looking at someone who's an investor, and the investor really cares about the cap rate. I'm sure you remember that from real estate school, and the cap rate, it calculates, it sort of gives us a comparable, because you can look at, again, there's so many different differences between the different types of assets, that if you're comparing the cap rate, that gives you one standard percentage to compare to all of the properties. And you could definitely look at like an office building and say, well, they're at an 8% cap rate, and I'm only looking to buy something that's between a 6 and an 8% cap rate. And then you can sort of look at that as a baseline or a standard across the different properties that you're looking at for an owner. The cap rates generally are different by location, and they're very different by asset type. So just like a kind of overview on the types of properties. Office buildings. So these are generally places where employees work and customers go to visit. So your doctor, lawyer, insurance, landscaping company, accountant, real estate, etc. Those are types of offices. We work in one. There are different types of offices within that. So within every asset type, there's subtypes. So for offices, there's generally like a cottage style or mid-rise, high-rise. The classification also depends on the area you're at. So if you're in an area where there aren't any high-rises, then the biggest building in the area might be considered a high-rise. So everything's a little subjective. Someone might represent that they have a Class A building. Class A generally refers to the types of tenants they have in the building, if they're a marquee tenant, or if it's a very well-maintained building. Class Bs, Class Cs, so they sort of go down tier from there. So Class A is the best of the best. But again, that's a little subjective, because someone could call themselves a Class A compared to the buildings in the immediate surrounding area. But then you go a town over, they may not consider that to be Class A. They may say, well, it's really a B or a C compared to our town. So that is a little subjective, but people throw those classifications out there just to get an idea of what you're looking at in an area. That generally does refer to office, but the classification Class A, B, and C could be used for any of those types of assets. So again, for office, cottage style is kind of like, there's a few of them on Catawba where they kind of look like, you have multiple offices in one building, and they sort of look like a cottage. They look like they could almost be residential, except they have maybe some sort of a covered facade. And then high rise is probably more like what you see in Charlotte. We really don't have any high rise in the area, but you might consider something like ours is only 2-story, where our office is in Cornelius. Just compared to the area, it could be considered a mid-rise actually. And then you have retail buildings. So these are daily needed for customer visiting. So you've got restaurants, all the things that are closed right now, really. The shops, hair salons, clothing boutiques, flower shop, gym, and those types of users. You could have a shopping center, strip center, regional centers, which are just places that attract people from the entire region. And then malls, open or enclosed malls. So they really get pretty specific in trying to classify types of assets. And then you might just have a freestanding building that would be like your CVS or Eckerd's. Generally, they are an out parcel, which means that it's its own freestanding building. It's on an out parcel to the building and sort of set aside from a shopping center. or it could just be completely freestanding and set alone and on its own property. They're sort of building one where there used to be a Rite Aid on the corner of Jeton and Catawba there. It used to be a Rite Aid, it's going to be a bank, so that would be a freestanding building. And then there's industrial, of course. The industrial is warehouse and storage space. I spent a lot of time with industrial. You know, this is more like construction, food services, freight companies, but it could really be anything. Like it could just be storage. It could be steel or wood. Sometimes they're manufacturing, sometimes they're not, and it's just a holding place. I've seen flower stores where they're doing wholesale. So lots of things where it's more of a holding facility and or manufacturing. And then depending on what they're doing depends on a lot of the different things that go into that type of asset. So you do have industrial park. There's actually an interesting industrial park here in Huntersville. And that's just basically a place where you have lots of different types of industrial buildings all together in one centralized location. And they're generally owned by different people. But they share the same roadways to get into that area. Generally, you see industrial in industrial parks because it's sort of containing that industrial usage so that they have generally a very easy access to an interstate or highway, and they're not going through residential areas to get to that industrial location. And you could have some that are heavy industrial or light industrial, some that are flex space. So flex space could be actually even heavy on the office side with just a small storage space available to them. And flex space is a big part of industrial, and but you get a lot of different types of uses. So you could have a mix of office and industrial in one location if it's a flex space, but it's still considered industrial. Multifamily. So multifamily is 5+ units, apartments, mobile home parks, or a portfolio of single family homes if several homes are owned by a single ownership. But multifamily is a little bit of a different animal. And that's quite different. I actually have not done a whole lot of multifamily, but I find it quite interesting. But I would probably refer multifamily out. Land, so a lot of things that go into land are zoning, utilities, the location of the property, because land can be so many different things. You could develop a residential property, you could develop a commercial property. It depends on the zoning. It very much depends on how close utilities are to hook up to it. Land deals on the commercial side can take a really long time, and I've heard horror stories about how long they can take, and then years into it, you lose the deal and it falls through because of some zoning change that you couldn't get past. So there's a lot that goes into that. And it's not on my board here, but we also have special use. So that's like medical, hospitality, it could be a church, just anything that's outside of these main classifications would be like a special use project. And I guess I'll just take a breather here. If anybody has questions, feel free to post, and I'll take a break. I should be able to reserve some extra time before the end of the, at the end of the slides so that I can take any questions that might have come through if there are any.
No one has posted anything on Facebook Live as of yet.
Thank you, Rachel, appreciate it. Okay, types of leases. So again, there's just a lot of these little nuances that go into commercial deals. Once you start learning them, it's not something to be intimidated by, but again, this is just a real overview. And if anyone wants to talk in more depth about any of these specifics, I'm happy to get into that. And over time, you absorb it, and it's, for me, second nature at this point. So, the primary types of leases are triple net, MG is modified gross, FSG is full service gross. There's a lot of different names for this. People like to throw out different kinds of terminology. So you've got the triple N, it's triple net. You've got MG, modified gross. Full service gross could also be gross lease. Modified gross can also be net lease, or net lease is very similar to modified gross. So, you know, there's a lot of overlap between these terms. And the biggest piece to that is the operating expenses. Yeah, but I'll just hit this other note on my slide here that everything's negotiable, right? So the lease rate, the term, annual increases, options to renew. So a lot of times we want to fit into the agreement an option to renew the lease in the future, because once a tenant has become established, they may want to stay. Options to renew are in the benefit of the tenant, but generally landlords understand and they also want the person to stay. Sometimes that actually even has a rate cap assigned to it, so they know what their option to renew, what the cost would be for that. Tenant improvements. So the tenant improvement, or TI money, is sometimes paid by the landlord, but sometimes the tenant will pay for that. Sometimes the tenant will pay and be reimbursed. There's lots of different terms to negotiating that. Generally, we quote the TI or make our proposal based on $1 per square foot of the space. And generally, the landlord already has a budget in mind for how much they're willing to spend on the space. This is typically not just carpet and paint, but a lot of times it could just be carpet and paint. I see most of the time landlords do not do any work on a space until they have someone new ready to sign the lease, because they may do carpet and paint and then find that somebody wants to just move a wall. And then once you move the wall, you have to redo the carpet and the paint. So it's like, you might as well just wait and make sure that you're doing everything that specific tenant wants, because again, everybody's different. Everybody has different desires and wants, and maybe they want to pick their own paint color. So unless we're doing specifically like a spec space, most likely it's going to be left in its raw condition with whatever wear and tear the old tenant left behind, and you negotiate what goes into the space. We also generally negotiate some type of free rent. We're always trying to get free rent. If you're representing the tenant, the landlord is generally expecting to give some sort of a concession on free rent, 1 month up front, something to give the tenant a chance to get established before they have to pay rent right off of the bat. And then sometimes you might see like first right of refusal. So if you've got a multi-tenant situation, I'm in a building and there's a space right next to me and I only have 1,000 square feet, but that other 1,000 square feet right next to me might be a great opportunity for me to expand in the very near future when I feel like my business is ready to do that. So I might ask for a right of first refusal on that space, so that if that tenant leaves, the landlord has to ask me if I want it and I have to refuse it before they can lease it to someone else. It would still have to be fully negotiated and at whatever the market rent is. Generally, you don't negotiate anything like that in advance, but it's just giving me as the tenant the opportunity to expand into that space, because that would be ideal for the tenant and for the landlord to just expand their relationship with that tenant. So going into operating expenses a little bit more, this is very similar to what you would expect in homeowners association dues. So it's a CAM, common area maintenance, and it's all of the expenses for the property itself that are actually distributed and paid for by the tenant. So if you're a landlord and you own a multi-tenant location, it's actually a pretty good deal because you get rent on the space. And as long as the spaces are leased, you're going to recover all of your expenses on the spaces in addition to your rent. So the rent really is pure profit, because the common area maintenance is the cost for all of the expenses on the property. And this is where the different types of leases come into play. If it's triple net, then the tenant pays a price per square foot plus a price per square foot on the CAM, which is all their percentage of all of the expenses for the property. and they're responsible for all of the maintenance and repairs inside the space. Triple net is the best for the landlord. It has the tenant paying for everything in the space, and that income on the space is pure revenue for the landlord. Whereas modified gross and full service gross has some part of the CAM already included in the base price. So on triple net, you would find a price per square foot to be much lower for the rent on the space than on a modified gross or full service gross. You're going to see a much higher rate because it has the CAM built in. And then you pay on top of that above your base year for operating expenses. So that starts getting a little bit complicated, but it basically just means the way that they're going to be paying for their CAM. Generally, there is always a CAM charge. So if someone's quoting you a rent on the space, you can expect that there's another charge that they're not necessarily telling you unless you ask for that amount. And there's all types of CAM caps that you can work in as part of your negotiations and say, well, you know, we won't pay over and above 3% per year, or lots of different negotiating tools among that. But the different types of leases really just mean it's a way for us as real estate brokers to know by looking at the type of property it is, if it's a triple net, what we need to be asking and what's going to be the tenant's responsibility without having to really ask a whole lot of questions. So you could actually even have like single net leases where, you know, there's some blend of, and triple net generally is a very specific to industrial space a lot of times. I mean, you will see it among other assets, but like full service gross is very specific, where you generally an office lease where you're including all of those operating expenses your first year, and you're just paying the amount of the rent, and that includes your operating expenses. But then every year past that, you're paying more and more as increases, as expenses for the property increase. You end up paying more in operating expenses. So those are some interesting differences. They are all negotiable. Everything's negotiable except for the CAM. The CAM is usually a set price, and so you can negotiate those terms in terms of the caps, but generally those are fixed prices for the property that the ownership is going to pass through to the tenant. So when we do lease deals, we have to pre-qualify our tenants, and I think on the residential side that you're probably having the residential, your residential customers go through like a lender and get underwritten and say, okay, we're pre-approved for this particular mortgage, and you know how much they're pre-approved to buy for. And we don't have that on the commercial side. So you can sometimes get it on the, so on the buying side, you're going to have that pre-qualification process. But for commercial real estate leases, there's no one backing that to see if they're a qualified tenant. So generally we're going through, before we're even starting negotiations or getting too far in the relationship with the prospect, we're getting proof of financials. We want to make sure that they're able to cover 3 times the lease rate in a given year. So we're getting tax returns, bank statements, you know, making sure that they need a loan if necessary, credit check. We're really pre-qualifying this tenant, getting a full lease application, generally from the prospect for the leasing before it even goes to the landlords that we're presenting an offer to. And that's really standard. They're going to want to make sure that you vetted them, and they're going to want to see all of that information at some point in the process before they sign a lease. Business registration. So if it's an entity that is renting a space, we have to verify that, and that's on sosnc.gov, Secretary of State. For North Carolina, we verify that the business has been registered. You can see in there who has registered the business, so you can actually see the officers of the company. So we need to make sure that all of our agreements are with an officer of the company. That starts with our buyer agency agreement. So we have to make sure that the entity name is exactly the same with the Secretary of State, and that the people signing for the entity are the true owners of that business. It is frequent that personal guarantees come into play. It is what it sounds like. The person is personally guaranteeing the lease. So even if it's an LLC or something where there's some sort of limit of liability in the company or layers of companies, if a personal guarantee is in place, then the person who's guaranteeing it is personally responsible if something happened and they couldn't pay their rent. So personal guarantees are very frequent. I, representing a tenant, would never offer a personal guarantee. It is frequently requested. And you can have some negotiation around that, you know, once they've been there for 2-3 years, we're removing the personal guarantee, that kind of thing. But it's very standard to have a personal guarantee attached to a lease. Unless it's like one of the national brands, franchise, that sort of thing, you'd see less of a personal guarantee required. LOI, and then the formal agreement. So we do have an LOI, that's a letter of intent. Letter of intent is not drawn up by an attorney. We actually draw up that document. It's outlining the standard terms that we would like to present an offer. So this is again representing the tenant. We would say, okay, we're proposing $18 a square foot. Your operating expenses are not included in that number. You know, we're requesting $20 per square foot in tenant improvement allowance. We want you to inspect all of the equipment before we move in. So there's all of these terms. We're presenting perhaps like a 3-year deal. Generally, leases are 3 to 5 years as a standard for a business. You might get some of the smaller spaces you could do for a year, but 3 to 5 is probably more standard. So you present the term of the lease. And all of these points are negotiable points. And a lot of times you'll see one being traded for another. You know, would you be willing to to pay more in rent and get less on the tenant improvements, or vice versa? The more that the tenant puts into the space in tenant improvements, the lower they might get on the rent because they're putting that capital in up front. So there's a lot of different negotiating points. The landlord may have very specific criteria. They might not have cash flow to do TI, but they might be able to go down on the rent. So you really sort of get a feel in the negotiating process what's important to the landlord and what's important to the tenant and what they're willing to trade. And hopefully you can come up with a compromise that works for everybody. And then from a property management perspective and dealing with the landlord, and from the landlord's perspective, I mean, obviously they want the strongest tenants with the longest terms lease with the highest rate. And it's important on the property management side to really manage those relationships, because specifically tenant relationships is one of the pinnacles of property management. The longer you can retain a tenant in the space, the less effort that the landlord has to give into marketing the space and lack of cash flow while it's vacant. So having a property management company that's constantly building that relationship with the tenants and maintaining strong relationship with the tenants is really a huge benefit to the landlords. So the better the property management is, the better your leases are in theory and the longer they last. So that's a really important piece on the landlord side. And then just to qualify a referral, you know, if you wanted to give me a referral, again, I'm welcome to work with anyone else who wants to do commercial or wants to dabble or just has questions. There's certain things I can answer and certain things I can't. I love to take referrals. I offer 25% in-house for referrals, so that can be a pretty good referral. And if you look at some of the lease deals, you could get thousands of dollars just for referring and sending a name that came through. So that's definitely advantageous and worthwhile to send referrals and not do anything. But if it's something that you want to pursue, I'd love to talk about that too. The main thing is to try to qualify the referral and get all of their information up front. The better your relationship is with them, and the better our handoff is, the stronger the referral is, the more likely you are to get a referral fee. So obviously that's a benefit to both of us. You know, send me their contact name, number, email, what they're looking for, what type of, you know, are they looking for a retail space or an office? What's their time frame? You know, some people are like, I got to get in there next month. At this point, you know, we're dealing with a little bit of a longer time frame if you're on the tenant side, most likely. What's their budget? What is their availability, and what's their preferred client contact method? I had someone send me a referral and they were like, you know, he's been like emailing me the whole time, seems to really like email. I couldn't get him on the phone. That's a great thing for me to know, because then I know the best way to get in touch with them and can be more successful with that referral. You can send me the North Carolina Realtor Real Estate Commission has template forms for referrals. You're welcome to send me one of those forms, or you can actually send me referrals through Command, and it can give me the option to accept that agreement straight through Command, which I thought was really neat. But yeah, send the referral form and get paid when we close the deal. I think that's it on my slides. So I just wanted to share some commercial real estate information and hopefully pique someone's interest. But again, I look forward to collaborating. I really enjoy and think that there's enough business out there for all of us. I'd love to get really specific with the type of work that I do and the type of assets that I work on. I actually really love industrial. There's not a whole lot of industrial out here. But my hope is to really focus in that area, and on the commercial side, focusing on an area of specialty is really an important piece. But I'd love to grow a team. We've got actually a lot of referrals coming through from this office. And even at this point, I've gotten some random referrals from people that I don't even know, which is great. I mean, that really means that networking is working. A lot of times we're building relationships one-on-one. So this time in quarantine has been pretty tricky. You know, definitely try to get in as much Zoom networking as possible. But definitely it's people knowing you, know, trust, like you, and you end up getting referrals. So that's an important piece, just for people to know you. And, you know, a lot of networking and prospecting for me is very specific to just asking questions, asking open-ended questions, trying to get information from them. And it really builds from there. That's why it's so difficult to build out scripts or templates, because I may ask a question that takes me down a completely different path. And that's why also, if you do have a referral, it works really well for me to work with that referral person directly, because there's no way I can think of all of the potential questions that I may have for that person. KW Commercial has a really great asset. There's a person called Mike Lipsy, and he is well known in the commercial industry. He is a teacher, but he's been in the commercial real estate world for a really long time. And he's generated a list of Lipsy 50. And they're just 50 go-to questions. You wouldn't just grill somebody and go down the list of 50 questions and ask them all of those questions. But it's sort of a go-to, like, here's a good and open-ended question. And then you kind of just try to hit a few of those that are applicable to the situation. So a template like that is really good. But it's never going to be the same questions on any specific call. You might have some general idea or some general questions that could be a little boilerplate, just to get your sort of foot in the door and ask some questions. But everybody's different too. It's very specific to the individual. It's specific to the property. And it's a lot of fun in that respect too. I really enjoy that. I mean, on the property management side, I have seen so many different things. It is never boring. It's always interesting. There's always different things going on. I'm constantly learning. And I think, knowing what you don't know is really important. I'm not afraid to say, I don't know, but I'll find out for you. And I think that that's really important. Um, and sort of having fun with it. I mean, you really are building relationships. I mean, these are people. There's sort of this thought that there's residential real estate is very emotional and commercial real estate is very analytical. And I think that's very true. I definitely have an analytical mind, but there are emotions tied to commercial real estate. They're different emotions. It's more emotional around money and livelihood and future. Whereas the residential is more that pain of, where you're living, your home. I mean, there's just so many different like real emotions that can get tied into that. It's definitely different types of emotions, but it can be emotional. I mean, when you're dealing on when you're working on a $5-10 million deal, there's a little bit of emotion tied up into that if it falls through a year down the road. So, it's, I think, unrealistic to say that there's no emotion, but there's definitely a lot of analytics in there. And I have heard sort of this stigma around commercial real estate agents shooting people down for information. And there is definitely a certain place where we get very specific on a specific asset where it might be difficult for us to give specific information. But in general, I want to be an asset for you. I'll never shut you down completely. I welcome questions. I welcome interest in the commercial world. It's not for everyone. It is very different from residential, but you never know. It might be something that you'd like to pursue. It's not all numbers. And I use a calculator for everything. So it's definitely doable and possible to learn and have those skills, maybe dabble or, move that direction in the future. So I'm excited to talk to anyone who's interested. Okay, and I see CC is ready, but I'm done anyway. So I appreciate anyone who's watching.
Thank you, Dawn. It was awesome.
Thanks, Rachel. Have a good day, okay?
You too.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.